Everybody, hot water, take a seat, charge your glasses. Make them welcome John back for part 2. Quiet at the back, please. Quiet! Quiet! A bit of hush and respect, please. Right, just like to welcome John back for part 2. And I'm looking forward to hearing this very much about Winston Churchill. So without further ado, I'll continue.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction. Welcome back everyone, and let's see no one's made a bolt for it in the interval. That's very encouraging. Thank you. So, no doubt we're all aware that a few years ago Churchill was voted in a nationwide poll as being the greatest ever Briton. Yes. Yeah. So anyway, a lot of the information you're going to see in this presentation is available on my website. It's not in any of my books, but it is available on my website in the form of an article. So if you want to refer to that afterwards, then please feel free to do so. So I take it from your reaction to that you don't think he was the greatest ever Briton.
Okay. What you mean?
Okay. So anyway, let's look
to his waistline.
Sorry?
Unless you're referring to his waistline.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, it's probably taller lying down than standing up. Yeah. So in my presentations, I usually put this slide in. Okay, and it's just a kind of an illustration of how we are fooled by mainstream history and how it always. Can everybody read that at the back, by the way? Is it?
No,
is it?
no, I can't. Sorry.
I can't do anything about it. Okay. I can sit on the floor here if you like. Okay. Well, I'll just read the slides then, for the benefit of those who can't read them. But I'm sure you're all aware that history has been falsified throughout history. Pardon the pun. You know, in order to benefit those in power and to perpetuate this agenda that has been ongoing for many, many years. You know, and these agendas don't belong to governments, as I'm sure you're all aware. You know, I think I'm preaching to the choir here. I mean those people with real power. You know, the people who sit above governments and use them as their puppets. So yeah, there's just a few quotes there on the screen. Obviously the top one is just a bit frivolous. This is from the musical Wicked, if any of you have ever seen it. It's a fantastic musical if you haven't. And it says, "Where I come from, we believe lots of things that aren't true. We call it history." And that's from the Wizard of Oz in Wicked. And then the second one is from Henry Ford. "History is more or less bunk." And then Voltaire, the French philosopher. "History is a lie commonly agreed upon." And John Hamer, whoever he is, in his book The Falsification of History, written in 2012, said, "Almost everything you think you know about history is totally wrong." Is what?
Cobblers.
Oh, fair enough. Right. Now, this is a quote. Do you need me to read it?
Yes.
Okay. "What if I told you that the version of history you were taught in school was heavily revised to favour your own nation's agenda, while in doing so fostered an unrealistic sense of false patriotism used to manufacture your allegiance to a corporate entity masquerading as your government?"
USA, 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 USA.
Yeah. And another quote. We will get into the meat of it in a minute, but yeah. This is by, again, another French guy, Honoré de Balzac. "There are two world histories. One is the official and full of lies, destined to be taught in schools. The other is the secret history, which harbours the true causes and occurrences." And one by Winston himself here. This is quite an interesting one. "History will be kind to me. I know this because I intend to write it myself." That's brilliant, isn't it? Okay. Yeah, John Hamer's just a bloody, one of those bloody conspiracy theories. He doesn't provide any evidence at all for anything he says. He just makes it all up as he goes along. Yeah. But what is a conspiracy theory? Again, this presentation is designed to you know, be shown to a wide range of audiences of various stages of awakeness, if you like. So I cover all this stuff at the beginning just for those people who are not aware, but I'm sure all you guys are totally aware. Okay, but it was coined by the expression conspiracy theorist was coined by the CIA in the aftermath of the JFK assassination to shut down dissent, essentially. But it's now used to discredit anyone who exposes the lies of the establishment, which we all know. And again, another quote about conspiracy theorists. Conspiracy theorist is someone who questions the statements of known liars, which makes sense. And a few more. A conspiracy theorist is a person who absolutely believes, and you cannot convince them otherwise, that powerful people who have lots of influence actually use their power to maintain or grow that influence. But a coincidence theorist is a person who believes that everything happens by sheer coincidence. There's no such thing as corruption, deceit, or backroom deals, and mankind just got over the desire for world domination. Which one sounds more insane? You don't need to answer. You know, I often tell people that I don't, it's a glib statement, a bit tongue-in-cheek, but I often tell people that I don't believe in coincidences because, you know, because for this reason. Everything is made out to be a coincidence. You know, 9/11 is just a coincidence. All these different false flags, everything that's going on, this agenda, all just a coincidence. But anyway. So, how easy is it for the establishment to fool all or most of the people all of the time? Well, it's pretty simple, really. I mean, first of all, we all know what's going on right now in this country and indeed the entire world, and, you know, a huge percentage of the population is already being fooled. But as I say, it's pretty simple, and you're going to see exactly what I mean in the next hour or so as regards Churchill. Although, again, I suspect I am preaching to the converted a little bit, but nevertheless, I'm sure there's going to be some stuff in here that you weren't aware of. Okay, so it's my contention that Winston Churchill was actually an evil, self-serving, narcissistic, opportunistic, hypocritical, treacherous, traitorous, perverted paedophile and a murderous psychopath. Well, if anybody can think of any other adjectives, I'll gladly add them into the screen for the next time I do this.
Coward, fresh murderer.
But apart from that.
Yeah, apart from that, what have the Romans ever done for us? Sorry, a bleak reference. So basically, I really need to come off the fence and tell us what I really think, don't I? So, okay, if you insist, I'll do that. Right. So you need some evidence for this, do you?
Yeah.
Let's start at the beginning. So some of the topics we're going to cover are, where are my sources for this information, first of all, his early life, his early career, his perversions, his politics, the occult, World War I, World War II, murder. And then we'll summarise it at the end. So I'm following the usual pattern that we're all, people who've been taught how to present, I have instilled into them, that is, tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you just told them. So this is where we're going. Right, so let's look at sources first of all. I've got an extensive collection of books, as you might expect from a professional researcher, some of which were published in the 19th century, which contain lots of information that's now been conveniently slipped down the memory hole, the Orwellian memory hole. For example, I've got one that talks about the real truth about the gunpowder plot, which was published in the 1880s, which is totally out of print now, it'll never be printed again, but obviously the gunpowder plot is another story for another time, but trust me, that was a complete false flag as well. Okay, but again, that, as I say, it's one for another time. So yeah, the internet, obviously, the ubiquitous internet, but having said that, the internet, I don't know whether you guys are finding this as well, I've noticed in the last couple of years it's very, very difficult to find stuff now. Yeah. They're censoring everything, all the search engines are being censored. I think websites have been flagged as to not be included in any internet search. So it is getting more difficult. Yeah, so, and also a lot of this information comes from a guy who some of you may have heard of, a guy called Thomas Trevor Stokes, who was known as T. Stokes to his adherents, of which I am one. He was an ex-MI, can't remember whether it was 5 or 6 guy, but it was definitely British intelligence, and he wrote extensively about Churchill. So a lot of this information that you're about to see, I got from that source, and this guy is a very, very credible source. This is not just some idiot that's made a few things up. You know, this is a guy who was in the know. He didn't actually personally know Churchill, but he was around, he was a contemporary of Churchill's, and I think he died just recently, about 2013, but it was like well in his 90s when he died. Okay, so those are the sources. Let's have a look at his early life. He was born into the English aristocracy. He was from the Dukes of Marlborough line, and he was born at Blenheim Palace in Oxfordshire, which was his family's ancestral home. His parents were the Jewish American socialite, Jenny Jerome, and Lord Randolph Churchill. Now, the fact that his mother was Jewish, she was 100% Jewish, means that in fact Churchill was a Jew on the premise that anyone who's born of a Jewish mother is classed as a Jew. So this is quite significant actually. Churchill was Jewish. Yeah, he was educated at Harrow School, and he intended to go for a military career, but he actually failed his entrance exam to Sandhurst, the military academy. He actually failed it twice, and then scraped through at the 3rd attempt. So he wasn't, our Winston, he wasn't exactly the brightest lamp in the street. You know, so, yeah, as I say, admitted to Sandhurst at the 3rd attempt. And he obviously joined the army upon leaving Sandhurst. And then he was commissioned in the army as a second lieutenant, as they all do when they graduate from Sandhurst. And he served in India and Sudan in the 21st Lancers Regiment. But it wasn't long before he grew tired of army life. It was very much a butterfly Churchill. He flitted from career to career, from political party to political party. So he decided, after a few years of army life, or a few months of army life, I don't know the exact figure, to become a politician. So he stood as a Conservative candidate in the Oldham constituency, which this is before the Labour Party was in existence. So it was like Liberals and Conservatives, and Liberals were the left, and Conservatives the right, obviously. But he stood as a Liberal candidate, and he somehow managed to lose the Liberal safe seat of Oldham to the Conservatives, which was incredible, really. Yeah. So,
it says on there stood as a Conservative candidate in the Oldham constituency.
oh, beg your pardon, I just got it the wrong way around. Sorry, yes, he stood as a Conservative candidate, and he managed to lose the Oldham for the Conservatives to the Liberals, yeah. Sorry, I do apologise.
He's a great politician.
Sorry?
He seems like a great politician.
Yeah. And then after he failed in that by-election, he decided to go back in the army, and he served in South Africa during the Boer War. Some of you may have heard the stories about his exploits during the Boer War, about how he escaped capture by knocking on the only door in this particular town where he was, and this was the only family that supported the British cause out of the entire town, and he just happened to knock on that door.
Coincidence?
Yes, coincidence. You see, I don't believe in coincidences, but anyway, after the Boer War, he contested Oldham again, but this time he was elected. He scraped in with a tiny majority. But ever the opportunist, good old Winston, in 1904 he decided to join the Liberals after opposing the Jewish immigration bill, which was intended to stop Jewish immigration, in fact, into the UK. So, you know, that's kind of significant knowing his background. And in 1906, being propelled rapidly up the promotion ladder, as aristocratic families tend to be, I can't imagine why. In 1906 he'd got his first senior position, and he was Under Secretary of State for the Colonial Office. So, as I say, his political progression was very rapid, and in 1908 he became president of the Board of Trade, which again is a promotion. And then 2 years later, lo and behold, he was Home Secretary, which is a very, very senior position, as we all know. Yeah, so obviously, you know, that's a career progression that befits the any prominent member of the establishment. You know, the likes of local MPs here or anywhere else, they'd have no chance of doing that. You know, their career plots are, you know, their career is plotted in an entirely different direction. Now, significantly, he was recruited to the Zionist cause. Again, with his Jewish background, it's hardly surprising. Not that all Zionists are Jews, but you know, it does help. You know, he was involved in some pretty shady extracurricular activities in his private life. As I say, being a Jew, which he was technically, he was enticed into the support of Zionism, which is almost synonymous with the support for the banking dynasties. And again, we'll see how this becomes important. Yeah, and he was actually well paid for his support for the Zionist cause as well. I don't have the exact figures, but it was a hefty sum that he was paid. So, yeah, he was also a Druid priest,
Yeah.
which, and he was very senior in the Druids as well. Also a member of the Golden Dawn, which is another exotic, esoteric secret society connected to, loosely connected to Satanism. And sometime during the period 1905 to 1910, we don't have exact dates, but he became a 33rd degree Freemason. Stop me if you've heard this story before. You know, or anyone who is anyone are pushed down these, they have these routes planned out for them, and they push them down them, and of course, you know, became a 33rd degree Freemason very, very quickly indeed. And so was his interest in the occult established. He claimed to have psychic ability, and the famed V salute is actually, doesn't mean victory at all. Does anyone know what it is?
From the Battle of Agincourt.
No.
It's a Nazi swore hand.
It's the symbol of the horned god. It's a satanic symbol.
Oh, yeah, because they've changed it now to that. Yeah, they do that
Yeah,
now.
that's right. Yeah.
Sorry, that was.
Yeah.
But they'll do that.
Yeah. No, I know what you mean about the Battle of Agincourt. That was the English soldiers taunting the French, wasn't it, saying I've got my two fingers, because what happened was, this is a diversion, sorry, but for those who don't know, in the 100 Years' War during the Middle Ages, if the French captured an English archer, because English archers were the supreme soldiers of their day, and they were feared throughout the world, they would cut the two fingers off so they couldn't fire a bow anymore. So the English soldiers used to taunt the French by going like that, to show them they still had the two fingers. Every day is a school day.
John, can I make an interesting correlation?
Of course.
When Churchill came out with his V for Victory nonsense,
Yeah.
that was publicised on the 19th of July. It was a year after Hitler ordered Britain to surrender to the Germans. That's the same date that Boris used Freedom Day. Freedom Day, 19th of July.
Okay, interesting, thank you.
Interesting correlation.
Yeah, thank you for that. Okay, there's a picture of Winston Churchill being installed into the Albion Lodge of the Ancient Order of Druids at Blenheim Palace on the 15th of August 1908.
The Queen was also a Druid.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, on to politics. We've touched a little bit on politics, but as I said, he changed political sides 4 times in total. We've only covered one, but he did. He flopped backwards and forwards across the House to suit his own personal agenda, and when it suited him, wherever he saw the best opportunity. And he had an interesting nickname, which actually reflects his popularity, or lack of it, amongst the politicians of the time, and that was, he was called the Shithouse, inspired by his initials of WC. So I think that tells us how well thought of he was, doesn't it? Yeah. So he got no qualms about selling himself to the highest bidder. He joined the Zionist cause because he was paid to do it. He was always open to bribery and corruption of any kind. And yeah, I mean, of course, you know, moving forward slightly, this is the reason, one of the reasons they opposed Hitler so vehemently. It's nothing to do with Hitler's politics, but it was because he was a Zionist, and you know, the bulk of Zionists are Jews, and in essence, it's a Jewish cause, although it's not 100% Jewish, obviously, as we know. But. And so, yeah, he accepted £150,000, which was it's a substantial amount of money today, but in the 1930s, it was a huge amount of money, from the Jewish lobby to engineer Britain into instigating World War II, which is what he did. It wasn't Hitler that instigated World War II. And if you want to read my book Behind the Curtain, you know, I provide plenty of substantial evidence that it was Britain that engineered the war and not Germany. Yeah. Now, what do these four people have in common?
Or leaders.
Right, okay, so we've got Andrew Jackson on the left. On the right, as you're looking on the right. He cancelled the first Bank of the United States, which was the first attempt at an American central bank. And he was he had an attempted assassination on his life, but fortunately the guy's pistol jammed. So Jackson knocked it out of his hand with his walking cane, and the guy was arrested and executed. But that was instigated by the Rothschilds, because obviously, you know, they run all the central banks in the world, and that was, you know, their idea, because he cancelled that bank and let the American government issue their own currency again. JFK. Shortly before he was assassinated, he introduced an Executive Order 11110, which gave the United States government the power to create its own monetary system and bypass the Federal Reserve Bank. 3 weeks later he was dead. Jesus, for those of you who believe in Jesus, we're told that he went into the temple and overturned the money changers. What used to happen in those days, apparently, was that the Jews used to go to Jerusalem to pay their temple tax annually, and the money changers had got a monopoly on a little coin called a half denari piece, which was the amount needed to pay the temple tax. Now, this coin bore, in the Jews' mind, the head of a pagan emperor. Now, and they didn't feel that was appropriate to pay a temple tax with the head of an emperor, but nevertheless, the money changers had cornered the market in those coins, and they charged exorbitant rates for them to actually use it, and that's why Jesus allegedly was so angered and overturned the tables. So again, you know, a few weeks later, a few months later, whatever it was, he was crucified. Whether that's a real story, I have my doubt, but it's an interesting story anyway. So yeah, they all fought the bankers. Now, moving on to the occult a little bit. Now, Sefton Delmer was a famous guy during the war. He was the chief wartime propagandist, and he confirmed that Churchill and Aleister Crowley were heavily involved in Satanism. Now, Sefton Delmer is an extremely interesting guy. And again, a bit of a plug from the book here, but in Behind the Curtain I go into the background of Sefton Delmer and how he was involved in all the lies that were emanating during World War II and afterwards about a certain incident that happened during World War II, which I don't think I need to name. So yeah, he was a very interesting guy. Not in a good way was he an interesting guy. As I say, he was largely responsible for the wartime and post-war demonisation of the Nazis and Hitler. You know, which again I cover in my book. But if you have any doubts about that, I would recommend online research if you can find stuff. But obviously, you're not guaranteed to find stuff anymore, unfortunately. Churchill is known to have sought advice on how to propagate the war using black magic practitioners, such as Aleister Crowley, who was again heavily involved in that particular activity. Yeah, so just confirming the representation of the home god with the V salute. Sometimes it's shown like that as well, and as someone pointed out, also like that now as well. But at that time, It was just the two figures like that. Yeah, and interestingly enough, V is the 22nd letter of the alphabet, which is a sacred number in Hebrew mythology. And furthermore, the Morse code for V is da-da-da-da. 3 dots and a dash is V, and that was used in wartime for transmitting secret information. They used to announce it using that V. That V symbol. Okay. So there he is, giving the old V salute. And again with the double fingers this time.
Live long and prosper.
That's the Vulcan.
No, Vulcan, yes. Live long and prosper.
Yeah.
How much did that cigar cost?
Vulcan is the god of destruction.
A lot.
That's some stovey, that then.
So let's talk about his perversions a little bit, shall we? It's not a very pleasant subject, but it has to be done. I mean, it may be shocking to some of you, I hope not, but there's no doubt that Churchill was an absolute sexual pervert. He was blackmailed several times over his tendencies for young boys, some as young as 12 years old. Again, this is Anthony Trevor Stokes that came out with all this information. And he even had an affair with his male secretary as well, which again is not widely publicised, of course. And even during the war, believe it or not, which I found absolutely staggering, that he was doing this during the war, which was raging in Europe and North Africa, even then he was a frequent visitor to the teenage homosexual brothels of Morocco in North Africa. So while this war was raging in Europe, this guy was flitting backwards and forwards across the continent, visiting homosexual brothels. Yeah, so... Huh? Sorry, I didn't catch that.
You have to do something with your D-off, he said.
Sorry, I wasn't advocating. He was an absolute monster.
Right. And it's also a fact that he spent more on women's underwear per week than most working men earned. Yeah. And that is, to me, that's just echoes of Tony Blair and the Miranda revelations. Is everyone aware of Tony Blair and the Miranda revelations?
No.
Ooh, okay.
Not at all.
In the 1980s, Tony Blair, under the name of Charles Linton, to protect his identity, was prosecuted for soliciting in a public toilet.
Really?
Was he referring to himself as Miranda at the time, or?
He was known as Miranda at university because he was known to be an absolute freakishly camp homosexual at university, and they all called him Miranda.
And Gordon Brown was as well, wasn't he?
I believe so. Yeah. All paedophiles as well. What a lovely world we live in. Okay, moving on to World War I. Let's look at some of the stuff it got up to. I mean, there's lots to tell about World War I, but let's just concentrate on a few incidents. And I think this is where it starts to get a little bit more interesting. Not that it's not been interesting, I hope. But most people know about the Gallipoli campaign, the failed Gallipoli campaign in 1915, where he sent thousands upon thousands of British and Australian and New Zealand soldiers to the deaths in a disastrous campaign, but it was Churchill's brainchild, and I believe, well, almost 50% of the participants in the Gallipoli campaign, and there were tens upon tens of thousands, almost 50% of them were either killed or wounded. But of course, sending innocent young boys to the deaths for what amounted to virtually nothing at all is just you know, another day in the life of the Satanist, really, isn't it? Yeah. So it was First Sea Lord at the time, responsible for many lost lives and some disastrous campaigns, such as the Dardanelles, Gallipoli. We've mentioned 50% casualties, and interestingly enough, the strange death of Lord Kitchener as well, which we'll come on to. So I asked the question of myself, was Kitchener murdered on Churchill's orders? I don't know if you know, everyone knows this. I realise, sorry, you're not all students of history, I do apologise, I mean, this is my forte, but I don't know how many of you know the story about Lord Kitchener, who Lord Kitchener was to start with. You know, he was the guy on the World War I posters that said, "Your country needs you," right? And he was he was probably as bad as Churchill, this guy. I mean, it was him that ordered the turning of a blind eye to children as young as 14 being recruited into the trenches in World War I. And it was also him that instigated the idea of women presenting non-combatants with white feathers as a mark of cowardice in order to entice people to join. It's got shades of what's going on with the vaccinations these days, isn't it? Enticing people to get vaccinated. Yeah, I mean, these people, all of them, they love sending young men to the deaths. It's their hobby, you know. So, yeah, Kitchener was actually a national hero, and it was also well known as a homosexual and paedophile too. And interestingly enough, approximately 80,000 battle casualties during World War I were under the age of 19, and 19 was the official age limit for entering the army. So 80,000 casualties should never have been in the army in the first place. But they don't care, do they, these people, you know. So. Anyway, Churchill absolutely detested his popularity, because he's a narcissist, Churchill. I mean, he craved attention, he craved praise, and someone taking the limelight from him he didn't like at all. So, Kitchener was on a ship. Again, some of you may not know this story, but I'll relate it, you know, for those that don't. Kitchener was on board HMS Hampshire when it sunk after a collision with a mine, allegedly. Yeah, allegedly. So, an MI6 colleague, so it was MI6, of T. Stokes, confided in him many years after Kitchener's death. And this is what he said, and I'll read this out for those of you at the back who can't read the small writing. Myself and my CO went on board the Hampshire. I was told to keep watch outside while he went into Kitchener's cabin. I put my ear to the door and heard the CO say, "I'm going to leave you with my pistol with one bullet. I will wait outside and you will do the honourable thing." We heard a shot, the CO went back and retrieved his pistol, and we hurriedly left the ship. Now, T. Stokes, the guy who told this story, is not known for his hyperbole and exaggeration or lying at all. He's a genuine, reliable source of real information, as I said before. So, you know, this is perfectly plausible, perfectly credible. Now, he also claimed that the sinking of the Hampshire was not an accident, it was a cover-up. Again, stop me if you've heard this story before. You know, it just never stops, does it? It's just been going on for years and years and years and years, and it probably will do for many more years as well, unfortunately, unless we can change things. And it was simply to cover up the murder by suicide, allegedly, of Kitchener. All right. Kitchener, unbeknown to the British government, had been secretly petitioning the German government for peace, totally off his own bat. So he got no authority to do this, but for some reason he was petitioning the German government for peace, which went totally against the agenda. They weren't interested in peace, they wanted to promulgate the war as long as they could. War is money, war is big money. And when this was discovered by Churchill, that just more or less sealed his fate. Now, on board the Hampshire, 645 men died. There were actually 12 survivors initially, but rather conveniently, they were all shot dead upon reaching the shore by the Home Guard, or whatever the equivalent was in the First World War. And the excuse was given that they thought they were Germans. Just a coincidence, again. So Churchill was aware that his support had diminished. That Kitchener's support for the war had diminished. He was taking Churchill's limelight, which he didn't like. And actually, recent dives to the wreck of the Hampshire revealed it was an internal, not an external explosion. Now we were told it hit a mine and sunk, but it was proved by the dive that the explosion was internal. So just make of that what you will, really. And he also planned the sacrifice of the Lusitania in order to entice America into World War I. Again, some of you may be aware of this. It is fairly common knowledge. But the idea was to entice America into the war and end their policy of isolationism, because at that point in time the entire American nation was against World War I. The politicians were pushing for it, obviously because the puppet masters up here were enticing them to do it, but the politicians were against it and the people were against it. So that was known as isolationism. They didn't want to be involved in a European war, as they said. And it was the same story in World War II, but that's another story for another time. As I said, the US establishment eventually decided that they wanted to join in with the fun, but it was public opinion that prevented it. So what was needed was and no politician wanted to risk his career. So what was needed was some kind of plausible excuse to drag America into the war. So Churchill hit upon the idea of sinking the Lusitania, which was a British passenger liner. Okay. So a pretext had to be created. You know, this is shades of 9/11, shades of 7/7, shades of whatever false flag you want to think of. This is just a early 20th century false flag. Churchill had been engineering America entering the war for a long time, and this was more or less just the next step in the plan. The Lusitania, however, what totally illegally was known to be carrying ammunition and arms. But this was never publicised. So, in actual fact, strictly speaking, by the rules of warfare, because Lusitania was carrying arms, it was actually fair game for the U-boats, even though it was carrying something like 1,600 passengers, because the Germans knew that she was carrying arms. And the reason that they knew she was carrying arms, which was covered up of course, but the reason that she knew that she was carrying arms was that a lot of people at that time were German immigrants in America. And in fact, again, a little known fact for you, maybe you heard it before, but in the 1890s America did a national referendum to decide which language was going to be the official language of America, and English won very narrowly. Lots of German immigrants at that time, yeah. So there were a lot of German dock workers at the port where Lusitania left, and they reported seeing caches of arms and ammunitions. So the German embassy in the US was neutral at the time of course, tried to put adverts in over 50 northeastern seaboard American newspapers, all of which were censored and removed, bar one which slipped through the net. And here it is. Again, I shall read that out. It's too small to even read on that screen. Notice, travellers intending to embark on the Atlantic voyage are reminded that a state of war exists between Germany and her allies, and Great Britain and her allies. That the zone of war includes the waters adjacent to the British Isles, that in accordance with formal notice given by the Imperial German government, vessels flying the flag of Great Britain or of any of her allies are liable to destruction in those waters, and that travellers sailing in the war zone on ships of Great Britain or her allies do so at their own risk. The Imperial German Embassy. So what they tried to do was put that advert in a lot of papers across the Americas, because they were trying to warn people that Lusitania was going to be at risk. So that ad actually appeared in the Des Moines Register of 22nd of April 1915.
22nd.
Yeah. So the German government had done everything possible to warn travellers that the Lusitania was a legitimate target for their U-boats. It was also carrying 90 tons of refrigerated butter as a cover, but it was carrying lots and lots of weapons and ammo. In fact, in 1995, when they did a dive to the wreck of the Lusitania, they found 15,000 rounds of ammunition, which was found in the wreckage, but Tony Blair issued a D notice to cover that up. Yeah, that old story again. Yeah. So again, it was an attempt by the German government to dissuade any passengers from boarding the Lusitania. Yeah, the German dock workers are aware, but it was always the intention of the banking dynasties, in association with Churchill, that the Lusitania would be sacrificed in an attempt to bring the USA into the German war effort. Yeah. So, yeah, this is a quote from T. Stokes again. It's long, but I will read it out because it's worth reading. Okay. The Lusitania's sinking created outrage that a passenger ship would be sunk and was a determining factor in bringing the US onto Britain's side in World War I. Both Pearl Harbor and 9/11 were staged theatre pieces, and so was the Lusitania, sunk with the same bankster Illuminati game plan. Winston Churchill was in charge at the Admiralty. The intelligence received by him and Lord Rothschild, his mentor and financial benefactor, also had access to all the Admiralty documentation, and his war team pointed to the fact that the many German emigres to America had been effective in keeping America out of the war. The worry to Churchill was simply that the US would remain isolationist or worse, although America could swing either way, it may yet support Germany. So a plot was hatched by Churchill, a 33rd degree Freemason in the Naval Masonic Lodge and Admiralty HQ, with the bosses of Cunard and the War Department, to sacrifice Captain William Turner, the Lusitania, and 1,198 passengers and crew. T. Stokes. I mean, if that doesn't give you an idea of Churchill's character and motivations, then I don't really know what else to say. And there's so much more to know about that particular incident. I mean, that's a presentation in its own right, but you know, I just wanted to touch on that. There is lots more information on my website about the Lusitania if you're interested in that, and in my books as well. Just another little plug there. So moving swiftly on to World War II. You probably all remember a little while back Anthony Blunt, who was I think he's curator of the Royal Art Collection, wasn't he? And he eventually was exposed as a Russian spy. And even he determined that Churchill was, confirmed that Churchill was determined to take Britain into war regardless of the human cost. This is World War II we're talking about now, by the way, not World War I. It's absolutely documented, and I present this documented evidence in my books, specifically Behind the Curtain, which covers the World Wars, that Churchill refused, contrary to what we're told, he refused all reasonable peace offers from Hitler up to and well beyond the beginning of the war. In fact, right up until the middle of 1940, Hitler was still reluctant to press ahead with the war. He didn't want war, he wanted peace. And this goes against all that we're taught and all that we intuitively believe, and I do understand that, but you can take my word for it. Absolutely, Hitler did not want war. We're digressing a little bit, but what I'm trying to prove is that it was Churchill that was the warmonger and not Hitler. Hitler was still making peace overtures to the British government in the middle of 1940. And this was the period known as the Phony War, which you may have heard of. The Phony War was a period of war that wasn't really a war because nobody was doing anything, nobody was attacking. So between September 1939 and May 1940, there was very little going on. But there was very little engagements on land, sea or air. So yeah, and as I say, it was the puppet of Lord Rothschild, and it was Rothschild that was twisting his arm into destroying Germany. Again, contrary to popular belief, it was Churchill that began bombing civilian targets, not Hitler. Again, this is all documented. The problem is that we believe what we hear and read in the mainstream press and mainstream history books, that we really believe that Hitler was this terrible demon that is being made out to be. I'm not saying he was an angel, don't get me wrong, but he certainly wasn't responsible for instigating and promulgating the war. Again, there's a whole huge chapter in Behind the Curtain about this and how we've all been totally deceived by this. I know some of you probably still don't believe me, but nevertheless, it doesn't make it untrue. You know, of course, it's all covered up, as I say, by the mainstream. But at the risk of repeating myself, and this is very, very important to understand, it was the international Jewish banking cartels that instigated the war against Germany. Why? One word: money. First of all, Hitler closed down the Reichsbank, so he could have been added to that list of people who fought the banksters. In fact, I think he was on there, wasn't he? I didn't mention him. He closed down the Reichsbank and he produced his own currency. And we know, I mean, even the mainstream admit that Hitler was instrumental in turning the economic fortunes of Germany around. There was full employment, workers were given fantastic holidays free, he built fantastic road infrastructure. The whole place was just such a successful economy without the influence of the Rothschild central bank. So Rothschild wanted them destroyed. How much more logical can you get than that? And also, of course, war generates billions for the bankers in the form of loans for armaments. So, you know, that's another good reason. I mean, Churchill knew that Germany was no threat to Britain, but he had to obey his master, Lord Rothschild. And Hitler stated many, many times, and this even appears in the mainstream, that he had no designs on Britain, or anywhere else for that matter. The war was absolutely forced upon him. So Churchill actually sold out Britain to the Jewish banking industry interests for his 30 pieces of silver. I mentioned the phony war. And it's very true to say that Hitler only invaded Belgium and Holland. In fact, he didn't really invade Belgium and Holland. He used them as a conduit to get at the BEF, the British Expeditionary Force, which had invaded France in May 1940. And the day that Churchill became Prime Minister was the day that the phony war ended. Because 15th of May 1940. And Hitler's response was to invade Holland and Belgium to preempt the BEF doing the same, because the BEF would have just done exactly what Hitler did, except they wouldn't have been vilified for doing it, you know, because they were fighting this big bad monster. Yeah. So now here's an interesting newspaper headline. Some of you may have seen it before. It's from the Daily Express, March 24th, 1933, and it says, Judea declares war on Germany. Jews of all the world unite in action. Boycott of German goods, mass demonstrations, dramatic action. Yeah. Basically what happened was, at the instigation of the Rothschilds, and in retaliation for Hitler shutting down the central bank, Rothschild began to demonise through propaganda what was going on in Germany. And it was the Jews that actually declared, this is getting really controversial now, so I hope you're all open-minded. You know, I'd get this presentation will get deleted from YouTube, I'll tell you. It was the Jews that declared war on Germany, and they began attacking German national shops because you know, Jews are Jews first and foremost, and only the country that they live in, and secondly. So Hitler's reaction was to clamp down on Jews. Some may argue he went over the top, but it was really restrained. Throughout the early 1930s, it was really restrained, and it was the Jews that were, you know, doing all the bad things to the ethnic Germans. So that's why he started building concentration camps. He built them as detention camps for people who he saw as his enemy, which they were. But I mean, just to give you some perspective on this whole thing, which I know some of you might be finding cognitive dissonance with, because it is when I first came across this information, I found it very, very difficult to believe, but it is, you know, documented. And that is that, I forgot what I was going to say. Anyway, yeah, it's all definitely documented and proven. It was the Jews declaring war on the German nation that provoked Hitler's response. Oh, I know what I was going to say. I was going to say, in fact, Hitler did not imprison every Jew. He only imprisoned the ones who he saw as a threat to the country. So all these documentaries, Hollywood films, we know what Hollywood's like, don't we? All these documentaries that you see about him randomly rounding up hundreds and thousands of Jews is totally incorrect. He rounded up the ones that were activists and were promulgating this unrest in Germany. In fact, throughout the war, this is throughout the war, not before the war, there were 150,000 Jewish soldiers in the SS. Now, hands up anyone who already knew that.
I had heard that. I didn't know there was as many as that.
Yeah.
I did hear
there were 3 generals, 3 Jewish generals in the SS, as well as lots of thousands of officers and obviously ordinary ranks as well. And not only that, in the Waffen-SS, there was soldiers from just about every nationality you can possibly imagine. And these joined the... I'm really getting off the subject here now, so I do apologise. I'll try and speed up a bit in a minute, but I think it's important. Nationalities from just about every country you can imagine. There were British people in the Waffen-SS. Yeah? You know, there were homosexuals in the Waffen-SS. There were black people in the Waffen-SS. There were even Arabs in the Waffen-SS. You know, it wasn't a racist regime as it's painted. But like I say, I'm getting off the point. But I just wanted to make that point there. And please, you know, don't think that I'm some kind of Nazi sympathiser, because it's not about that. All I'm interested in is the truth. And if you guys don't believe me, then I would suggest you look it up for yourself, because it's maybe not easy to find, but there is a lot of information out there that tells the real truth about what went on in Germany in the 1930s and 40s.
John, that was an interesting date as well. That ties in with the first week of the season of sacrifice, and that they quite often use
Right.
declarations of war, for example.
Okay, yeah, you're right, yeah. So there's another. Judea declares war on Germany, boycott German goods. So, yeah, World War II began this was the first war which civilian targets were indiscriminately bombed. Coventry was bombed. And does anyone know the story of the firebombing of Dresden in February '45? Yeah, a few people. Just for those who are not aware of what happened in... yeah, just for those who are not aware of what happened in Dresden in February 1945, a fleet of several thousand American bombers bombed Dresden, which had a population of something like 600,000, but that was doubled by... Don't forget this was beginning in 1945 when the war was coming to an end. I mean, Germany was absolutely on its knees. The whole transport infrastructure was destroyed, the food infrastructure was destroyed, people were starving. And this is why I say the sadistic firebombing of Dresden, because it was a totally non-military target. The only soldiers that were there were wounded soldiers who were recuperating. And then the population had been doubled in the previous few months by people fleeing from the east to avoid the Russian hordes. Right, so there's about just over 1 million people in Dresden. Now, the Americans firebombed it, and have you heard of firestorms? Firestorms caused by bombing. What happens is the temperature, there's so much incendiary bombs dropped on a target, the temperature becomes so hot that obviously the heat rises, and when the heat rises, and so much heat is rising, the wind has to rush in. So you were getting like 300 miles an hour hurricanes whistling down the streets of Dresden, and they were sucking people into the fires. They were reckoning that something like 450,000 people died in one night. Do we hear about that?
No.
No. There's so much more to know about World War II. I know.
Documentary about that called Hellfire.
Hellstorm.
Yeah. Hellfire.
Oh, Hellfire, yeah, sorry, yeah. There's another one called Hellstorm, isn't there, which is a different one, yeah. Yeah, not only that, people ran into the river to escape the heat, and low-flying American fighter planes machine gunned them all to death. This, don't forget, this was a point where Germany was totally on its knees. It had lost any ability to fight back. This was just it was a sadistic ritual sacrifice by fire.
And who was behind
Instigated
it,
by Churchill.
Churchill.
Yeah, with the collusion of the American Air Force, obviously. And then, of course, there's the Rhine Meadows killing fields. Who's heard of the Rhine Meadows killing fields? Anyone?
No.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Again, the Rhine Meadows killing fields. What happened was, after the war, the Allies rounded up every German they could find, civilian, soldiers, surrendered soldiers, and they put them into what was called the Rhine Meadows camps. Now, there were approximately 3 million Germans in these camps. Now, bear in mind that camps is a very, very loose description of what they actually were. They were just meadows. This was the coldest, 1945, at the end of the war, this was the coldest spring on record in the 20th century. Right? They had no shelter, they weren't given any food, there were no latrines, nothing. And they reckon that at least 2.5 million German civilians and soldiers in these camps, for want of a better description, died of exposure in the space of about 2 or 3 months. Any soldier who tried to feed them was threatened with being shot. Lots and lots of stories around that, but again, suffice to say that. Again, it's another topic
Any idea why they did that?
It was revenge, pure and simple, bloodlust revenge. Yeah. That again, that was instigated by Churchill and Eisenhower. That was their plan. That was their brainchild. You can call it a brainchild. Anyway, sorry, I realise I'm doing a lot of digressions here, and I didn't mean to, but I just thought you might all find it interesting, that's all. So, yeah, British intelligence, we're all aware of the bombing of Coventry, yeah, indiscriminate bombing of Coventry. But British intelligence absolutely knew that Coventry was about to be bombed, but deliberately didn't evacuate, thanks to Churchill. And 900 were killed or badly injured in those raids. The reason, sorry, let's go back to that. The reason that he didn't tell them, he said, and I mean, there could be an element of truth in this, to be fair to Churchill, but he said it was because by this stage, Britain had cracked the Enigma code, and they didn't want the Germans to know that they cracked it. But even so, you know, it's still not moral, in my view. So, as I said, the bombing of Dresden was an Allied war crime. You know, these are the kind of crimes that the German High Command went to the gallows for after the war. You know, as I said, 1,000 Allied bombers, thousands of tons of bombs. Yeah, 300,000 to 400,000 dead. Yeah, it's very upsetting, isn't it? Yeah, and Churchill, the greatest ever Briton, was quoted as saying, before they decided to do the raid on Dresden, "I don't want any suggestions how to destroy militarily important targets around Dresden. I want suggestions as to how we can roast the 600,000 refugees from Breslau in Dresden." Yeah. Yeah. So, but as I said, maybe the greatest Allied war crime of all was the Rhine Meadows killing fields. Yeah, I've already said all this, but so I've preempted this. Yeah, and it's estimated 2 million German soldiers and civilians died of exposure, starvation and dysentery in that brutally cold spring. American soldiers guarding the inmates were warned under threat of death not to feed the starving millions, while others found great sport in randomly firing their guns into the masses of huddled bodies. And this is all Churchill's brainchild, of course. So if you guys thought it was bad to start with, I think you begin to see just how bloody bad it was. But there's more. Okay. Of course, it's known that Churchill committed at least 3 murders. I mean, he didn't use his own hands to do it, but he ordered them. Okay. He wasn't stupid enough to commit them with his own hands, you know, but of course this meant that others were involved. And could they actually be trusted to keep his sordid secrets? Well, let's see. Okay. So as I say, at least 3 known murders. First of all, his mother. Good old Winnie murdered his own mother. Right. I'll come on to explain why. A guy called Sir George Smith Cumming, who was head of MI5, whom he confided his mother's murder to. And Sir T.E. Lawrence. I guess we all know who T.E. Lawrence was, do we? Lawrence Ferrari, absolutely correct. Yeah. So let's look at the murder of Lady Jenny Churchill, shall we? Right. When her husband, Lord Randolph Churchill, died in 1896 of syphilis, as someone mentioned earlier. It was you, wasn't it? Was it you? Oh, I don't know. He left a trust fund for his wife and sons. But Jenny actually deceived Winston and his brother Jack by not disclosing this particular clause in the will. And she had an expensive social life. She was a social butterfly. She was known as virtually a prostitute amongst the upper classes. So she led a very, shall we say, immoral and debauched kind of lifestyle. You know, the kind of lifestyle that we'd all aspire to if we could. You know.
For yourself.
I am. And so she had this expensive social life, and she actually used a son's share of the estate to fund it. She actually deceived the 2 sons, Winston and Jack, for about 20 years and kept the money for herself, basically. And Jack especially, he was struggling financially. I mean, when I say struggling financially, I mean, can you just imagine a Churchill struggling financially? This is all relative, of course. You know, I'm sure his struggling financially would be our riches beyond our wildest dreams. Yeah. But yeah.
He could only get to his club 3 times a week.
Yeah, this is it. Yeah, this is it. Yeah. And in February 1914, Jack finally found a copy of his father's will. I don't know how that came about. I don't have that detail at all. But he read it, and he discovered that himself and Winston could have been claiming the equivalent of £50,000 a year from his death in 1895. So this is almost 20 years later. So he's been cheated out of £50,000 a year for 20 years. Yeah. So, you know, they were a little bit upset about that. Can't imagine why. Because Jenny had systematically taken Jack and Winston's inheritance. I mean, Winston was absolutely incensed, as you would imagine. He bore a grudge about this, and also he hated his mother for all the affairs that she was having that he believed dragged the Churchill name through the mud. And as a politician, of course, in those days it was a huge scandal, and it affected him materially because it held him back because of his association with that family that were this disgrace and talk of London society. You know, and he believed, probably with some justification, that it seriously hampered his career progression. But, you know, he didn't do anything in haste. He did everything in a very calculated way, and he actually bided his time to act until the right circumstances presented themselves. So he actually sent a letter to his mother, and I've got it here and I'll read it to you again for the sake of the people at the back. We had always thought that Papa was very wrong in not making any provision for us during your life. It makes a considerable difference to finding that Papa's will was not made, as we were always led to suppose, carelessly and without any consideration for us. It is quite clear that he never thought that while you were single you would be unable to pay us an allowance, and the clause in the will covered the situation which did actually arise of your remarriage. So he wasn't pleased, although it's a very restrained letter, shall we say, but it was absolutely livid. Right, so it took a while, 7 years, but Winston, he did actually gain his revenge in the end. And one of the things that he found out, again, which added fuel to the fire, was that he was born only 7 months after his parents got married. And again, this was a huge stigma in the 19-teens and the 1920s, especially for somebody in public life. And he really, I mean, this was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back once he found that out, because that really did put a dent in his career and his reputation. Okay, and so, because he already despised his mother for what was a ridiculously public sex life, but he actually felt that her behaviour made him a laughingstock, which he had a point probably. And then when he discovered that he'd been conceived out of wedlock, as I say, that was the straw that broke the camel's back. And then, maybe that wasn't the final straw. Maybe this was the final straw. He actually found out that Jack was not Randolph's son, but one of Jenny's many lovers, so he was only his half-brother. And of course Jenny had lied about that as well. Now, Churchill at this point confided in George Smith Cumming, who was head of MI6, I think I said MI5 before, didn't I? But he was head of MI6, and they were friends. So, as friends do, he was distraught, he confided it in George, and also to Lawrence of Arabia, T.E. Lawrence, who had also confessed to Churchill the intimate details of his torture by the Turks. Now, I don't know if you're aware of what the Turks did to him, but it's not very nice, and it involves genital mutilation. So I won't go into any details for those of you who are squeamish, because it's not nice to talk about anyway, but he wasn't a complete man, shall we say that. Right. So, yeah, there's some mutual confessions going on there. So by this time he hated Jenny with an absolute passion, and like all clinical psychopaths, he had absolutely no qualms whatsoever in plotting her death and acting on his baser impulses, shall we say. Now, there was another character involved at this point in time. Some of you may have heard of Bernard Spillsbury, who was a famous Home Office pathologist at that time, who was involved in a lot of famous murder trials, such as Dr. Crippen and quite a few other prominent murders of the time. Now, Spillsbury, strangely enough, was also a very ambitious man. He was probably a sociopath, maybe not an out-and-out psychopath, but he was definitely a sociopath who got little empathy or compassion for his fellow man. And he, amongst many of them, would do absolutely anything to advance his own career and reputation. And he, as I said, he was the medical expert at Dr. Crippen's trial and several other prominent murder cases. And contrary to political protocol, as a friend of Churchill, who was the Home Secretary at the time, Spillsbury was involved in prosecuting a serious criminal case, which was not allowed by criminal protocol at that time, and I believe probably is still the case. And he actually knew that the remains found at Crippen's home were not female. So it wasn't Crippen's wife at all. So Crippen was actually innocent. Well, he may not have been innocent, he may have murdered a man as well, for all I know, I don't know. But he certainly, Spillsbury lied at Crippen's trial, put it that way. Yeah, so, and then Spillsbury shared these secrets with Churchill of how to commit an undetectable murder, because this guy was a Home Office pathologist, he knew everything there was to know about poisons and ways to disguise murders or, whatever. Better rush along a little bit here, time is marching on, isn't it? So in 1921, in June 1921, Jenny fell and broke her ankle, and she developed gangrene, which needed a leg to be amputated. And this took place at the hospital where Spillsbury was employed. Another coincidence. Yeah. Now, prior to the amputation, Churchill had met with Spillsbury and Smith Cumming. So I reckon this is where they colluded in actually in effect, the murder of Jenny. Churchill had something over Spillsbury because he knew he'd lied under oath about Crippen, yet he still protected him. So there was a favour to be returned. Now, he hired a nurse for home care for Jenny when she was released from her hospital after only 3 days with an amputated leg. unusual. So he hired a nurse. And Spillsbury recommended loose bandages to allow oxygen to the wound. Now, I'm not a medical person, I don't know if anybody is a medical person, but apparently I'm told that is the worst thing you could possibly do, is allow oxygen to a wound that has been gangrenous. And of course the inevitable happened. It fed the gangrene, which returned in a few days and killed Jenny. Jack was absolutely furious. He questioned Winston over and over again because he suspected that Winston knew something that he wasn't telling him. And then, of course, as soon as the incident had happened, the nurse disappeared without trace. Nobody knew who she was never seen again. So, it was all very contrived, very convenient, and of course the death certificate didn't even mention gangrene. It said it was a hemorrhage of the femoral artery. Eventually Spillsbury was rewarded for his services to Churchill rather than to the country with a knighthood. But for the wording of the death certificate, there would have been no suspicion whatsoever, and it was only that kind of raised a few questions in people's mind, and often it is just one tiny error in these circumstances that lead people to do more research and find out exactly what's happened, and this was exactly what happened in this case. And this was the beginning of his little short murdering career. So yeah, poor old Jenny. So now we have move on to Sir George Smith Cumming, who also was done away with. He was the second known victim. He was the head of MI6, and he was just like Churchill and a lot of the other characters in this wonderful little story. He was prone to lying, exaggeration, hyperbole. He was involved in a car accident with his son who was killed. And he actually invented an absolutely ridiculous story about him having to hack his own leg off with his penknife to survive. I mean, you know, the guy was just an inveterate liar, and you know, like a Billy liar, like a Walter Mitty type character. And he couldn't keep secrets, but nevertheless Churchill was daft enough to confide. Did you want to say something? Did you want to say something? Oh, sorry, I thought you just... Oh, sorry. Yeah. But nevertheless, Churchill confided in him. And Cumming also allegedly had an affair with Jenny, which Winston wasn't pleased about. And when Cumming was talking to Churchill at one time, he just happened to mention Jenny's finances. So it was clear that Jenny had been confiding to Cumming about the family finances. So again, this absolutely enraged Churchill. So, Cumming was also a bit of a rogue. He was suspected of misappropriating MI6 funds. He owned 4 aeroplanes and 8 yachts. Who the hell wants 8 yachts? One for each day of the week and one left over to spare. Yeah. So Churchill ordered a cover-up because Cumming was his friend. And also because Cumming knew the truth about Jenny. Now, in 1923, Churchill had been paid £500,000. This is in 1923 pounds. By Burma Oil as a consultant. Yeah. Cumming knew this, and as he was a bit of a spendthrift, old Sir George, he was always short of money, even though he was misappropriating MI6 funds and spending like, you know, money was going out of fashion. He was always hard up, so he asked Churchill for money. And then, of course, he suddenly died inexplicably at home. Now, Churchill had a friendship with Spillsbury, as we've already covered, and T. Stokes confirmed that Spillsbury recommended curare as a virtually undetectable poison in order to get rid of Smith Cumming. And it's believed that Churchill sent Cumming an envelope allegedly containing the money that he was asking for, and it was delivered by an Irish male IRA member, perhaps. Yeah, no less. Because, again, I don't know if you know the real truth behind the IRA, it's not what we're told. these are controlled opposition, the IRA, right? So all that nonsense throughout the 70s and 80s and the 90s with the IRA before the peace agreement, it was all a false flag, a hoax. Anyway, again, I'm digressing, that's another story for another time. And it is believed that the lethal dose was given via a pinprick of curare by the guy who allegedly handed the envelope to Cumming. And Cumming dropped dead instantly, basically, on his doorstep. So that was that. Now, let's move on to Lawrence of Arabia. There he is, handsome young man-ish. Thomas Edward Lawrence. This was some years later. But it was actually, Lawrence wrote a book, which some of you may have even read, called 7 Pillars of Wisdom. It was the only book he wrote. And it wasn't published till after his death, and that's significant, and I'll come on to explain why. So this guy was Churchill's third victim, known as Lawrence of Arabia, a very close friend. Now, after World War I, Churchill had become colonial secretary, so he was responsible for hiring and firing envoys. And Lawrence, as we all know, because of his role in World War I, negotiating with the Arabs, he was appointed as a Middle East envoy due to his extreme knowledge of that area. And Lawrence, because it can be confided in by Churchill, was well aware that Churchill wanted his mother dead. Yeah, we'll talk about 7 Pillars of Wisdom shortly. Lawrence had clearly, actually, stated that the book was to remain a work in progress for several years before he would publish it. And as we'll see, there was an incriminating chapter in there which was locked away and is still believed to be in the bottom of some dusty filing cabinet in MI6. And I'll come on to that very shortly. Now, in 1921, Churchill and Lawrence travelled together at the 1921 Cairo conference, and unfortunately for Lawrence, he let slip that this manuscript contained a chapter, the 7 Pillars of Wisdom book, a whole chapter on Churchill. And he made no secret of the fact that there were sensational revelations about it regarding Churchill. Who in the right mind would do that? But there you go. And the book was actually published a few weeks after Lawrence's death, minus the incriminating chapter. Again, stop me if you've heard this kind of story before. Yeah. But T. Stokes, as an intelligence officer, actually had access to this chapter, which was still in existence at the time of his death. So this is where he got his information from. Now, let's move on to the details of Lawrence's death and how it was done. Does anyone know how he died, Lawrence?
I thought it was in a motorbike accident.
Correct, yeah. On a motorbike. Yeah. Now, Lawrence asked Churchill whether he should publish his autobiography. And Lawrence, again stupidly, admitted he was also carrying out research into bone breaks and gangrene. Not the wisest thing, but there you go. So I believe that Churchill panicked at this point. But he also knew that Lawrence was a keen motorcycle enthusiast. And on the 13th of May, again we've got a nice number there, the 13th, one of Lawrence, he had a whole fleet of motorcycles. He was a very big fan of, for those of you who know your motorbikes, I don't really, but I'm told that the Brough Superior at that time was the daddy of all motorbikes. You know, they were 100 miles per hour plus bikes. And one of his bikes was actually tampered with, the brakes were loosened. And there were a couple of young boys down the country lane where Lawrence lived, where he used to accelerate down this lane because there was no traffic in those days, so he felt quite safe. And one of the 2 young boys that were walking actually stepped in front of Lawrence, pushing a pedal bike, which caused Lawrence to crash. And the boy said later that he'd been paid £1 by an Irishman, presumably the same one paid £1,000 by Churchill to deliver the money to Cumming, but that might be incorrect speculation. Yeah, so immediately afterwards the boy was whisked off to the USA after remaining in protective custody for a short time. Nobody really knows what became of him. But Lawrence didn't die immediately. He was unconscious, but he was still alive for several days afterwards. And he was in a bad way, obviously. So apparently they summoned this Mr. Cairns, who was the country's leading brain specialist at the time. He was someone from London, and he also happened to be a friend of good old Winston's. Now, he immediately, as soon as he got to the hospital, he issued a bulletin saying that Lawrence had taken a turn for the worse. Yeah, and also, I forgot to mention from the other slide, both boys that were involved in that accident, both their parents were denied access to their sons for several days afterwards. You know, the boys were put into what they call protective custody, and even the parents weren't allowed to see them. So again, it's all very, very suspicious. And after Mr. Cairns arrived and issued this bulletin saying that, you know, coincidentally Lawrence had just taken a turn for the worse as he arrived, Lawrence died the next day. Oh dear. He was 46 years old. Right. And Churchill, Churchill then decided to, suspicion had fallen on Churchill by this point, and he tried to deflect suspicion away from himself by making ridiculous claims that couldn't be proved. And this was that his friend had been murdered by foreign agents. Lordy, lordy. Of course we believe you, Winnie.
The Russians.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, or the Taliban. Yeah. Yeah, but Lawrence's brother wasn't buying any of this. He categorically denied that that was true, and he remained suspicious of Churchill. But had Churchill gone too far this time? I mean, after all, Lawrence was a national hero. There was a lot of press coverage at the time, a lot of speculation about what really happened. And then rumours started to come to light about an unmarked black car, you know, which had been seen in the lane at the time of the crash. Now also, George Brough, the guy who built the motorbikes that Lawrence loved, he found specks of black paint on the wreck machine because he examined it after the accident and he found specks of black paint. So, is the boy and the push bike story just a fabrication? Well, lordy, lordy, blow me down. This has got shades of Princess Diana's crash, isn't it, in Paris, with the black paint, with the paint on the cars there involved. Yeah. So then Brough was ordered to keep quiet by MI5, and his widow later confirmed that he was ordered not to mention the black paint in his report. So he didn't. Very wise of him, I would suggest. And also was forbidden from attending the inquest. Again, not a surprise when you know what we all know. Now, a soldier stationed at a nearby army camp was going to testify that he, at the inquest, that he'd seen the black car as well that day in that lane. But just before the inquest, oh, what a shame, he shot himself.
Oh. That was careless.
I know, yeah, it's terrible. It's all coincidence, of course. Rather convenient and coincidental. Now, after he died, despite a thorough search of Lawrence's cottage, the missing manuscript which incriminated Churchill could not be found. MI6 had actually taken it into custody, according to T. Stokes, where apparently it remains today, to this day, probably, as I say, in the bottom of some dusty filing cabinet in some basement in MI6. So yeah, as a senior intelligence analyst, Stokes had got access to thousands of secret documents, many of which he disclosed after he became a whistleblower. So yeah, Murder 1 was committed as revenge for his mother's deception and for depriving him of his inheritance. Murder 2 was because he was being blackmailed for money and also felt betrayed by Cumming. And Murder 3 was through fear of his being exposed as a murderer. Yeah, and also because of the manuscript. Now, General Charles de Gaulle, where does he come into the story? Well, actually, he could have been victim number 4. It was known that they tested each other. You know, it wasn't just Churchill they tested him. De Gaulle actually hated Churchill too. And significantly, while de Gaulle was in exile in England during the war, he refused to fly anywhere at all. And when questioned about this, he said, anyone whom Churchill dislikes tends to have accidents. So we're coming to the end now. So we're not too late, Maureen, it's only 5 minutes. Yeah, so summarising. Yeah, this has hopefully demonstrated my original assertion right at the beginning, if you remember, that Winston Churchill was, indeed, actually an evil, self-serving, narcissistic, opportunistic, hypocritical, treacherous, traitorous, perverted paedophile and a murderous psychopath.
It's Satan.
And a psychopath, yeah, it's a good point. It didn't appear on there anyway.
Yeah.
Okay, so was he evil? Yep, tick. Narcissist, yep, tick. Opportunistic, tick. Hypocritical, treacherous, traitorous, perverted, paedophile, murderous psychopath. So I'll ask the question again. Was he the greatest ever Englishman? I think not somehow, don't you? Any questions? I hope that was enlightening.
You know, when I was seeing the that document that was supposed to be that Stokes had information on,
Yeah.
where he went, it was to do with was you saying it was when Lawrence and him went to a conference or something?
Yeah.
So what do you think's in that?
Do you mean the document, the portion of the book that Lawrence wrote where he exposed Churchill?
No, I thought you said there was something that Lawrence had written.
No, that was what we were referring to. I'm sorry if I didn't explain that very well, but yeah, that was what I was referring to. Sorry. Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, you know, when he found out about that his brother was a half brother, he was actually having an affair with his mother.
Yeah.
Did you find any information that perhaps even he himself was not a product of his mother?
I haven't, but it's a really interesting question. You know, I don't suppose we'll ever know on that one, but
Possibly was a Rothschild.
yeah, I've heard that. I've heard that. It's not beyond the bounds of possibility, is it? Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. What do you think about the idea that Hitler was a Rothschild?
No, I don't believe that.
Don't believe
I've again, in one of my books, I've done a counter argument to that. I think that's just disinformation and a psyop.
Kate Middleton is.
What?
The Rothschild.
Yeah, she's in the bloodline, definitely.
Yeah.
Who's that Kate Middleton?
Kate
Yeah.
Middleton, yeah.
One more question, Steve?
Yeah, John, do you remember the date the Lusitania sank offhand?
I know it was 1915. I can't remember. I mean, I can go back in. I think.
Oh, it's no worries. I'm just wondering or curious. I might have heard.
I feeling it was May 15th.
Was it May 15th or 13th?
Something like May
I think
15th.
it was
Oh, was
May-
that the date that they put the
I think
advert
it
in
was
the
May
paper?
13th.
Was
Was
it?
mentioned some
I was wondering if it landed on an occult date, a bit like the Titanic did, the Feast of
You're
Mars.
obsessed with the occult, you know.
That's what
Well, no, it's a fair comment because they're obsessed with the occult.
That's
So
what he does his talk.
yeah.
Beltane.
Beltane, yeah.
May the 1st.
Yeah, apparently the Hall God sign, I once seen in a documentary where it was interviewing Leonard Nimoy.
Oh, yeah.
And he said how he was the one that made up that
That one,
sort
yeah.
of sign for the Star Trek.
Vulcan.
The Vulcan sign. And he said apparently he got that, his parents were Orthodox Jews, and he went to like a Jewish service at a synagogue with his family. And he actually seen, especially like the men making that sign.
That's
It's a
interesting.
Jewish
That's very interesting. I didn't know that, but that is very interesting. Yeah.
What about his ancestors and his descendants? I mean, he seems to like come. He seems to come from a family who seems to always be doing warmongering.
Yeah.
Because I mean, I heard John Churchill was
The first Duke of Marlborough. He was a general in the army, wasn't he? Yeah.
Yeah, he helped William of Orange come over here. And,
That's right.
And
Yeah.
get control of the Bank of England.
That's correct. Yeah.
So they've always been favoured with the
Yeah.
bankers.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
I mean, now we've
Have you
got
got your tickets?
his grandson. Isn't he CEO of what's that UK company? Circle. So, yeah, his grandson, Isn't Winston Churchill's grandson
Oh, yes.
CEO of Serco? We've just got £322 million contract to do extend the.
I didn't know that again either, but that's interesting
You
information.
learn something here.
Yeah, every day's a school day for all of us.
Yeah.
For all of us.
Right. Thank you, John. What a
My
wonderful
pleasure.
evening we've had.
Really appreciate that.
We've got a raffle to do, but first can I present you with a Twistica hat?
I shall wear it with pride.
He's already got the t-shirt. And because you're an author, I thought you might be interested in, do you remember the book, The 50 Shades of Grey?
I've heard of it, but I don't know anything about it.
You're a popular author. I mean, you remember, everybody was reading it. Well, anyway,
was there something about it's full of sexual
Yeah,
references,
it
wasn't
was. So you
I don't
probably
know.
didn't
Very
read it.
badly written.
So anyway, this is even better. This is called The 50 Shades of Grey. So I'm going to read a couple of excerpts here.
All right, yeah.
Pleasure and pain can be experienced simultaneously, she said, gently massaging my back as we listened to her Coldplay CD. And one more, right? Well, two more. Hurt me, she begs, raising her skirt as she bent over my workbench. Very well, I replied. You've got fat ankles and hairdress sense. I'll give you another one. By the time I finished, her bottom was bright pink. I had mixed up the baby oil with Thousand and Island dressing.
Is that
One
like
more.
the style of 50 Shades of Grey?
Yeah. But this is your present. Oh, right. I'm a very naughty girl, she said, biting her lip. I need to be punished, so I invited my mother to stay for the weekend.
I love it.
There you go.
Oh, thank you so much, mate.